Hello and welcome to the Idiot Book Nook podcast. My name is Blazewing and my pronouns are they, them.
I am the reading dragon, and my pronouns are she, her.
I'm Lady Punnett. My pronouns are primarily she, her. Sometimes today is a they, them kind of day.
And I'm Crittershy. My pronouns are she, her, they, them. Today is a her day.
And we're getting into The Thief from the Queen's Thief series by Megan Whalen Turner. We're doing chapter 7 today, but before we get into that, if you'd like to follow us on social media, you can do so at lanktr.ee/idiotbooknook. You'll be able to find links to our podcast, to our YouTube, to all of our individual socials, and all of that jazz, so feel free to go check those out. In the meantime, narrator, are you ready?
Yep.
All right, Chapter 7 from The Thief from the Queen's Thief series by Megan Whalen Turner. Take it away.
Good feelings persisted between myself and the magus until the next morning, when Pohl discovered that most of the food was missing from one of the packs of provisions. He called over the magus. He called the magus over to him, and they talked quietly, throwing glances in my direction. The magus looked into the saddlebags himself and swore. He said something to Pohl under his breath, and they both crossed the clearing to stand in front of me. The magus was carrying his horse crop in one hand. I stood up warily as they came,
I hope you ate well.
said the magus.
Not lately.
I answered before I realized that another response might have been better.
Hold him.
The magus raised the crop. When Pohl grabbed me by my arm, I ducked away, but I was too late. I planted my feet and tried to overbalance him, but I ended up with my head locked under his arm. I grabbed him around the knee and tried to throw him, but we both went down, and he landed on top. He shifted his weight until most of it lay on my head. He held me pinned while the magus beat me across the back and shoulders with his horse crop. I screamed curses, I am not sure what kind, into the grass and heaved with all of my strength, but Pole would not be moved. He only ground my head harder into the dirt until I was exhausted and couldn't get my breath to yell anymore. The magus went on with a few strokes after that and stopped. When Pole released me, I grabbed his shirt in order to pull myself to my feet. He helped. As soon as I was up, I chopped him under the breastbone and left him gasping while I headed towards the magus. I had never been so angry in my life. Not even in prison, in the king's prison, had I been this humiliated. If Pole had not grabbed me by the arm and jerked me back, interposing himself, albeit hunched over and breathing painfully, between me and the magus, I am not sure what would have happened. The magus had taken one look at my face and was stepping back quickly. I wasn't aware of any sound but Pole's labored breathing as the magus and I stared at each other. My mouth was so full of things I wanted to shout that I couldn't get any of them out, which was just as well. If one thing had come, they would all have. How dare he treat me this way? How dare he? Finally, I spat in his face. He dropped back further to avoid the spittle, and I turned away. I went to my blankets, where I threw myself down on my face and covered my head with my arms. I rubbed my face into the wool of the cloak rumpled underneath me, and except for that, I didn't move all that time. That Pole made breakfast, and the others ate and packed up camp. Pole came over and touched me lightly on the elbow. Get up, he said. Oh, touched me lightly on the elbow.
Get up.
He said very quickly, very quietly. He didn't offer to help me, and I noticed when I did get up that he stayed out of arm's reach and watched me carefully, his weight forward on his toes. Sophos was holding my horse. He'd moved it next to a stump that I could use as a mounting block, but I ignored the stump and pushed the horse away from it. Sophos came around the horse's head to offer me a leg up, but I ignored him as well. I put one foot into the stirrup and jumped onto the horse's back. I snapped the reins sharply to keep it from sliding. Sidling. The horse threw up its head in surprise. I stopped to take a deep breath and let it out slowly. I could feel my eyebrows pressing together, and my teeth were so tightly clamped that the muscles in my jaw jumped. I took another breath and reminded myself that it wasn't the horse I was angry at. Nothing but my own ambition was keeping me near the Magus. I could walk away from this party of overeducated adventurers if I chose. Neither the King's Reward nor Pole could stop me. But I wanted to get to be a kingmaker myself. I wanted to be the first one to steal Hamathesis, Hami, Hami,
Hamiates.
Hamiate's, thank you, Hamiate's gift in hundreds and hundreds of years. I wanted to be famous. Only I couldn't steal the damn thing if I didn't know where it was, and only the Magus could find it for me. I would stay with him until he led me to the stone, but I promised myself that someday I would stick a sharp knife into his arrogance and give it a good twist. The Magus and Pole had mounted their own horses.
We'll swing west, then we'll swing west then to the stream and hope to find some kind of village somewhere along it. You think that's our best chance?
The Magus asked Pole. Pole nodded. The Magus stuffed the map he carried in his hand into the bag behind his saddle.
This way then.
He said and led us through the trees. My horse followed just behind him as usual. As we rode, I looked back over my anger from a little distance. I'd been so mad that I'd frightened the Magus, even with Pole between us. That was a new sort of event in my life, and I relished it a little as the morning passed. I was also pleased that I'd held my tongue. Saying things I shouldn't has been the origin of most of the painful episodes in my past, and it would certainly be an improvement in my character if I had a little more control over my own tongue.
You are you okay?
Sophos whispered from beside me. I looked at him from under my eyebrows, which were still drawn down.
Oh, sure.
I said. And I was okay. The horse crop hadn't been heavy enough to do any serious damage. The clothes the Magus had supplied me with were thick enough to keep the skin from breaking. I wasn't disabled. My back hurt, but the fire would fade by nightfall, and whenever we got wherever we were going, I would still be able to do my job. The Magus would never do anything to impair my usefulness. We came to a shallow river bordered with shrub, and it followed it until sorry. We came to a shallow river bordered with scrub and followed it upstream until we came to a break in the olive groves, where the other crops had been planted. The Magus turned his horse and led us back into the trees.
There will be a town somewhere close. Pole and I will ride to get more food. Embiotes, I'm leaving you in charge. For God's sakes, don't take your eyes off the thief.
He didn't look at me as he spoke, but Ambiades cast a contemptuous glance in my direction. I noticed I had ceased to be Jen and returned to being a kind of unreliable animal, like a cow that's prone to wandering away. The Magus and Pole left their horses and packs with us and set off up off the trail that followed the river into town. What food there was, they left in the backpacks and told us to eat for lunch. Sophos opened the bags and took out the bread and some warm, sweaty pieces of cheese and handed them around. He gave me a loaf of bread to divide, and I kept most of it before passing the rest on to Ambiades. He protested.
I didn't have any goddamn breakfast!
I snarled, and he backed away. Evidently, my anger was still effective. He wasn't going to bring up the reason I'd missed the morning meal. After we had eaten the bread and the slippery cheese, and were chewing on the dried pieces of jerky, Sopho said mournfully,
I'm still hungry.
I crossed my arms without saying anything. That was their tough luck.
We could get some fish out of the river.
Ambiotes pointed out.
Pulls the fishing line and hooks in his pack.
Sophos looked over at me.
Well, don't expect my help.
I said.
We don't ever expect you to be helpful, Jen, but I'll bet you'll want some fish if we catch it.
Said Ambiotes.
I could fish and you could watch him.
Suggested Sophos. I saw that Sophos had also placed me in the category of unreliable livestock. Ambiotes.
You're terrible at fishing. You jerk the line and lose the bait.
I could watch him while you fish.
Ambiotes snorted.
If he got up and walked away, you wouldn't stop him. No. What we'll do is tie him up.
You will not.
I said.
How?
Sophos ignored me.
There's rope in the Magus's pack. Go get it.
Sophos went while I continued to protest.
You're not tying me up. The Magus said to keep an eye on me. He didn't say go fishing.
Shut up.
Said Ambiotes.
It's your fault there's nothing to eat.
No,
I said.
you're not going to tie me up.
I'd been sitting cross-legged on the ground when Ambiotes leaned over me with the rope. I rolled away. He dropped on top of me, across my sore shoulders, and I yelped. He slipped a loop of rope over one of my hands and back, pulling on the loop tight over the new pink skin on my wrist where the sores had almost healed.
Don't!
I yelped again. I grabbed the rope to keep it from pulling away tighter and tried to slip the loop off, but the rough rope dug into the tender skin. Ambiotes yanked on the rope, pulling it out of my hand, and tightened the loop.
Hold still or I'll pull it tighter.
He said, and I gave up. I sat still while they tied my wrist and my ankles together, complaining the entire time.
Be sure and make it tight.
Ambiotes told Sophos, who was working on my ankles.
Hold. Hold on. It's too tight.
I said.
You're tying my hands too tight.
Shut up.
Said Ambiotes.
Are you sure it's not too tight?
Sophos asked.
Of course I'm sure. Have you got his feet done?
Ambiotes,
I made one last effort to convince him.
you've tied my hands too tight. I can't feel my fingers. You have to loosen them.
Maybe you should, Ambiotes.
Don't be stupid, Sophos. He's just saying that. Look, his hands are fine.
They are not. Look.
I held them up to Sophos. The pink skin on either side of the ropes was already puffy, but he was looking at my fingers.
They aren't blue.
They will be soon.
They will not. Come on, Sophos.
Ambiotes had collected the fishing gear out of the Magus's pack, and he pulled Sophos away. I wanted to shout for them to come back, but I was afraid that close to an Etolian town, someone else might hear me. One curious villager could get us locked in a cellar until the Queen's guardsmen came to interrogate us. I didn't want to be publicly beheaded, and the ropes were not so tight that I couldn't stand them for a little while. I kept thinking that at any moment the Magus or the uselesses would come back. I sat and watched, my hands turn blue. Ambiotes and Sophos didn't return from the river until they had seen Pole making his own way down the riverbank. They found me lying on my side, breathing quietly, and trying by mental effort to force the blood past the constricted knots out of my hands, which were swollen and mottled.
Oh no.
Said Sophos.
Damn right.
I hissed.
Get the ropes off. Be careful.
Ambiotes had started tugging at the knots, and the pain was shocking. He jerked on the ropes and pulled the knots even tighter.
Stop. Stop.
I said.
Just leave them. You have to cut them off.
But he wasn't listening. He managed to loosen one loop of rope, and he squeezed it over my fist, scraping the skin off my knuckles.
You're killing me!
I was reduced to yelling as Pole rushed into the clearing. He pulled Ambietes away and looked down at my hands, and then at the fish lying in the dust, forgotten.
Go get some more fish, both of you.
After a couple of uncertain steps backwards, both Sophos and Ambietes turned and hurried into the bushes by the river. When they were gone, Pole set about carefully removing the knotted ropes. I didn't bother to whimper suggestively. I lay quietly while he cut the ropes away and only hissed when he pulled them away from the skin where they were stuck. He started to straighten my curled finger.
Don't.
I said.
They've got to be flexed. The blood has pooled.
I'll do it.
I promised.
Myself.
After a moment, he nodded.
Where's the Magus?
I asked.
He sent me ahead with some food. It's a good thing.
He looked over his shoulder to the river.
He doesn't need to know about this.
Oh, yes, he does.
I said, and by that time I wanted to see Ambietes flailed alive.
No,
Said Pole.
he doesn't.
He crouched down a little more so that he could look into my eyes.
The Magus has staked his reputation and his life to find this silly stone wherever it is, and he'll murder the person who prevents him from getting it. And that person is not
He shook his finger in front of my face.
going to be Sophos.
I could see that there was no way to get Ambietes punished without dragging Sophos into trouble as well.
His father sent me to make sure he's safe and that he learns something on this trip, but he is not going to learn what happens when you ruin the plans of a man like the Magus.
It was more words spoken altogether than I'd heard Pole use yet. He wrapped one hand in the fabric of my shirt and pulled my face closer to his.
My orders are to keep him safe and out of trouble. Whether we succeed in retrieving something from a fairy tale is not important to me. Do you understand?
I nodded my head vigorously and then shook it back and forth. Yes, I understood. And no, the Magus didn't need to be told after all. After all, when I thought about it, I had no grievance against Sophos, and Ambietes' hash I could settle on my own. Paul went over to his pack to pull out the relief kit and brought back some bandages and salve to rub on my sore hands and a little paper packet of dried berries.
Chew 2 of these.
He said.
They'll help with the pain. We'll tell the Magus one of the sores got reinfected.
How long have I got, Pole?
Till what?
Till we get to where we're going.
How would I know?
You know how much food the Magus bought?
He thought for a moment.
2 more days.
The Magus came back with the rest of the food and accepted Pole's story about my wrist without question. He only seemed concerned that my hands would be functional, and Pole reassured him. Ambietes looked scornful, but Sophos was visibly relieved. When we rode back into the olive groves, he moved his horse alongside mine and apologized very prettily. I told him to shut up and watched him blush. I don't know what had passed between him and Ambietes down at the river, but Ambietes seemed to have fallen quite off his pedestal. I thought he would probably climb back up again, but not soon. Meanwhile, Ambietes kept his horse near the Magus, and Sophos fell back to ride beside Pole, or sometimes beside me. I asked him why he had such a fancy cloak, and he blushed again. He was as regular as clockwork.
My mother bought it for me when she heard I was traveling to the city to be with a new tutor.
The Magus?
Yes,
Where were you before?
one of my father's villas on the Iteos River. It was nice there.
But
My father came for a visit and found out I couldn't fence and I couldn't ride and I didn't like going hunting. I like to read instead.
Sophos rolled his eyes.
He threw my riding instructor and my fencing instructor and my tutor out the front gates of the villa. Then he said Pole would teach me riding and fencing, and I'd live with him in the city where he could keep an eye on me.
Paul is your father's man?
I glanced over my shoulder and met Pole's eyes for an instant before I turned back to Sophos.
He's captain of my father's guard.
I whistled soundlessly. A man's son has to be pretty important to him if he has the captain of his own guard give him riding lessons and then lives without his captain altogether so the son can have a bodyguard. The olive groves changed in character as we moved through them. Instead of tightly packed rows of trees, there began to be space between the trunks. The irrigation ditches thickened with weeds and silt and were eventually choked out of existence. More dry oaks appeared, and we were eventually riding between trees that had gone entirely back to the wild.
Doesn't anyone harvest these olives?
Sophos asked as he saw signs of old fruit rotted in the grass. The magus overheard him.
Not anymore.
He said over his shoulder.
Since the plague, there aren't enough people in Atolia to harvest all these trees. The town where we bought provisions was probably once responsible for this part of the Sea of Olives, but there are only 5 or 6 families living there now, and they manage only the grove nearest them.
I knew about the plague years. Sorry. I knew about the plague years that had come 30 years before I was born. It had traveled with the trading ships across the Middle Sea, seeping through the lowlands and killing off entire families. In the wine shops in the city, they said that as many as half the people in Sunis had died. All sea trade stopped, the crops rotted in the field, and Edis had closed her passes, trying to keep the sickness out. My grandfather, who had been a young man during the plague years, had told me that no thief would touch the possessions of a plagued victim for fear of contagion. Everything was burned.
Are there places like this in Sunis,
Asked Sophos.
where there aren't enough people to farm the cultivated land? Not many.
The magus answered.
Sunis has always been a smaller country than Atolia, and so it's already has a surplus population again. There are few abandoned farms. The place we stayed before starting up the mountain, for example. The single surviving member of that family left the farm in order to go to the city to get an education. How do you know that?
Asked Sophos, always one to miss the obvious.
I was he.
The magus glanced over at me, our horses never moving swiftly between the trees, and had stopped, and mine dropped its head to collect a snatch of tender grass. After a moment, he said,
It's astonishing, Jin, but you are obviously thinking something. I am curious to know what it is.
I was thinking of my numerous relatives, most of whom I had always considered a grievous burden, but if there hadn't been but there hadn't been one that I loved. I but if there hadn't been one that I loved, I wouldn't have landed myself in the king's prison. It was better, I supposed, to have all of them than none. I was I think it was the first generous thought I had. Sorry guys, this is really weird. I think it was the first generous thought I have ever had about some of my cousins. I told the magus.
I have an overabundance of relations, and I wonder if I am better off than you.
You could be.
He nudged his horse onward. After a while, Sophos started talking again. He was rarely quiet for long.
If there aren't enough people left in the village, why don't people move from somewhere else? Where else?
the magus asked.
The rest of Atolia?
Sophos hesitantly suggested.
They're dead too, stupid.
Ambides answered, and the magus winced.
The plague thinned the population across the entire country.
He explained more gently.
There are very few surplus people anywhere, even in the cities. They could come from Sunis. Yes, they could.
That was clearly what the king of Sunis had in mind.
That would be an invasion.
I said.
So?
Ambides challenged me.
These hands! He's gonna catch these hands!
Jin.
So the Aetolians might object.
So the Aetolians might object.
But they aren't using the land, Jin.
Sophos protested, and I wondered how he would feel if the positions were reversed and it was Aetolia annexing the land of his people.
They might object anyway.
I said,
That won't matter.
said the magus.
It will to the Aetolians.
I said to my horse. At the end of the day, we reached the edge of the Sea of Olives. We'd been following a wagon track, long overgrown. When it turned south, the magus led us away from it, back between the trees. A quarter of a mile further on, the trees ended, as if the gods had drawn a line across the earth from the cliffs, on our left down to the river, somewhere out of sight, and on to our right. The mountains were black against the pink and blue evening sky. They'd been hidden by the trees for a long time, and it was reassuring to see them again. Ahead of us, there were no trees and a few bushes of any kind. The earth was broken into ridges of rock and rubble. The setting sun threw black shadows across the black ground.
What happened?
Asked Sophos,
It is the dystopia.
said the magus.
We'll stop here for the night.
He explained as Pole cooked dinner that the dystopia was the remains of the boiling rock that had poured out of the sacred mountains thousands of years ago. The ground was rich with minerals, but it was too hard to allow plants to take root. It was difficult to cross and impossible to build a road through. It was an it was as empty as any piece of land in the entire world.
There is, of course, a myth to explain it.
The magus said, yawning and rubbing his hands through his hair.
But I'm too tired even to listen to Jin tell it. So I will just say the Eugenides tried to use the thunderbolt he'd stolen from the sky and started the fire that burned all the ground.
He killed his brother.
I said from where I was lying on my blankets.
What was that, Jin?
His parents, not the goddess. His mortal mother and father had finally had children, and Eugenides killed his brother by accident in the fire. That's when Hamiathes saved him. That's when him. Sorry. That's when Hamiathes saved him, and when Hephaestia gave Hamiathes his gift to reward him because she was fond of her brother.
So now we know everything.
Ambiades said sourly from his blankets, and we all went to sleep without another word. I had a strange dream that night of a marble walled room, and a woman in white, and I woke just as the moon was setting behind the olive trees. I had trouble getting back to sleep, so I sat up. Pole was on watch. If it had been the magus, he would have told me to lie down again. Sophos would have wanted to talk, but Pole just looked at me across the embers of the fire without a word. I stood up and paced a little back and forth, practicing my stretching exercises to loosen the muscles in my back. There were a few sore spots left from the magus's beating, but it was the pain in my wrists that bothered me. I cursed Ambiades under my breath and crossed over to the fire to squat down near Pole.
Hey, those berries you gave me.
The also?
Yeah, do you have any more?
He turned to his pack and pulled a small relief kit from it. Inside was a leather sack which held the berries. He poured out a small handful into his palm and transferred them into my open hand.
Only two at a time.
He reminded me.
Be blessed in your endeavors.
I thanked him automatically and popped the berries into my mouth before lying back down. I continued to flex my hands in training exercises until I was asleep. The magus took fate in his hands the next morning and left Ambides, Sophos, and me alone with one another again. He thought he'd glimpsed a fire between the trees in the night, and he wanted to be sure we were unobserved when we crossed the dystopia. He and Pole went to scout. Before they left, Pole handed Ambiades and Sophos their wooden swords and told them to practice and do nothing else. Ambiades pretended not to understand, but Sophos nodded his head earnestly. They were both stretching out their muscles as Pole and Magus disappeared from sight. As soon as they were gone, Ambiades turned to Sophos and poked him in the ribs with his swords.
Up and at 'em.
He said.
I haven't finished the stretching exercises.
Sophos protested.
Oh, forget them.
Said Ambiades.
You warm up as we go.
So Sophos put his sword into guard position, and they began circling each other. I watched them from where I lay, with my head propped against the saddle. Ambiades struck over the top of Sophos's guard, but Sophos remembered his lesson and stepped to one side to block. He forgot, however, to follow through with a thrust of after his block, and by the time he remembered, the opening Ambiades' guard was closed.
Good block.
Said Ambiades, trying to hide in his surprise, and swung again. Sophos blocked, but he underestimated the force of the blow and had to back up to regain his balance. While he retreated, Ambiades pushed in and whacked him on the ribs. Sophos brought an elbow down to cover too late, as if his arm would have stopped anything but a wooden sword. Ambiades managed to whack it as he pulled his sword back. Sophos yelped, but Ambiades pretended not to hear, looking superior. He rushed Sophos again, and in the guise of fencing practice, began to give him a series of bruises he wouldn't forget for a month. I was reduced to calling advice.
Look,
I said as they disengaged.
every time he tries to ride over the top of your guard, he leaves his right side open. Step left to block his attack and then counter immediately to his ribcage.
I wasn't as patient as Pole. I couldn't wait for him to figure this out on his own,
I'm sorry.
said Sophos humbly. He was standing with his shoulders slumped, rubbing a sore elbow. He dropped his sword into the dirt.
You're a better swordsman, Ambiades.
Now the line is I'm just not fast enough.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry. I'm just not fast enough. You're a better swordsman, Ambiades.
Ambiades shrugged, as if to say,
Of course.
and Sophos blushed. I snorted.
All it shows
I said.
is that Ambiades is 6 inches taller than you and has a longer sword, as well as a longer sword arm.
The smug look gone, Ambiades turned on me.
What do you know about sword fighting, Jen?
I know your sword. I know your guard is terrible. I know that any opponent your size would cut you to pieces.
Do you mean yourself?
I'm not your size.
Coward.
Not at all. If I got up and beat on you, Paul would come back and beat on me. I have work to do, and I don't like to work with bruises.
Pole wouldn't know.
Of course not.
Ambiades came to stand over me.
You're just a coward making excuses.
He kicked me in the side. It wasn't a heavy kick, but it was hard enough to leave a bruise in muscles that I might be needing at any moment.
Ambides, you can't.
Sophos looked horrified.
Do that again, and I'll tell the Magus.
I said. He leaned over me, his face ugly in contempt.
Gutter scum can't fight its own battles,
He said.
No.
I said.
Gutter scum gets drafted into the infantry and fights for a worthless king and hangers on like you watch.
Jin,
Sophos protested.
that's treasonous.
Do I care?
I said.
surprised Sophos.
Ambides' contempt made Sophos writhe.
His kind only ever serve themselves.
Oh? And who else are you serving?
I asked him. It had been a casual dig, but it hit a target. Ambides' face twisted, and he swung his foot back, and that time he would have broken my ribs if I hadn't rolled away. When he lifted his foot to kick me again, I grabbed him by the heel and pulled him off balance, then twisted in the dust to hook one foot behind his locked knee. He went down, and I was almost to my feet and crouched to jump when the Magus and Pole reappeared. The Magus raised his eyebrows. We separated, and Baides got up and began brushing the dust off his sword. I lay back down with my head on the saddle.
No unpleasantness, I trust.
Said the Magus. No one answered him. After a very quiet discussion between the Magus and Pole, we left the horses with Ambides. The Magus had wanted to leave Sophos with the horses, but Pole wouldn't let him stay by himself, and he wouldn't leave him with Ambides either. It was clear that things had gone from bad to worse between Sophos and his idol. So the Magus, Pole, Sophos, and I headed into the dystopia on foot. I was more than glad to leave Ambides behind. We walked all day, following the Magus, who followed the directions of his compass. There was no trail at all, and we picked our way between and over the rum- rumpled slabs of porous black rock. We carried our own water. There was none flowing in the dystopia, but there must have been some in the ground because the grasses grew in clumps and bushes larger than clusters. Everything had dried to sticks and prickles that caught on our clothes as we passed. The rock's rough surface tore cloth and rubs raw. The rock's rough surface tore cloth and rubbed raw skin that slid across it. The Magus explained to Sophos that more water moving across the lava could break it down into rich soil, but that this area was higher than the Sea of Olives and only had one river, the Aracthus.
The Aracthus has carved itself a canyon and doesn't cause much erosion outside it. Later, it reaches the plains below this and dumps what minerals it has collected there. That land is some of the best farming property in all of Atolia. What about the Sea of Olives?
Sophos asked.
It's a watershed. It's a watershed from the winter rains that fall on the dystopia. Once the rain stops, most of the cracks empty and the earth won't support crops. That's why it was all planted to the olives before it was abandoned.
Crossing the dystopia, I again felt like a bug caught out in the open. My upbringing was making itself felt, and I longed to have more of the sky shut out. The mountains did rise in sheer cliffs on my left, but their steepness shut me out instead of enclosing me in. I'd been more comfortable in the Sea of Olives. In the evening, we reached the Aracthus and turned upriver towards the mountains. I tried to ignore the world stretching out forever behind my back. A few trees grew near the river, as well as bushes, and the lava flow didn't seem to be much of a wasteland as it was. The river was narrow, but deep in most places, and had cut a channel as it twisted and banged against the rocky sides of its bed. Every once in a while, it jumped over a shallow waterfall. Sometimes we walked along the edge of a chasm in which the water flowed. Sometimes the chasm grew wider and shallower, and we walked on the sand beside the river itself. As the sun was setting, we hiked around the curve and came to a larger fall, maybe 2 or 3 times my height. The river was closed in on the side of the opposite of us by bluffs. We could see striations in the soil, all of them red or black. On our side, the riverbank was almost flat. The lava had been ground into a beach. And beside us rose a more gradual hill that cut off the view of the dystopia between us and the olive sea. The magus stopped.
This is it.
He said,
This is what?
I asked.
This is where you earn your reputation.
I looked around at the empty rock and river and the sandy soil under my feet. As far as I could see, there was nothing to steal. Nothing at all.
And thus ends Chapter 7 of The Thief from the Queen's Thief series by Megan Whalen Turner. Next episode, we'll get into our discussion of this episode, and it seems like we have a few developments to talk about, which will be nice. But first, if you'd like to follow us on social media, you can do so at linktr.ee/idiotbooknook. You'll be able to find links to our podcast, to our YouTube, to our Twitch, and all of our individual socials. You guys should totally come check us out and see what we're all about on other various platforms. With that being said, pardon?
Yeah.
With that being said, for this episode of the Idiot Book Nook, I'm Blazewing.
I am the Reading Dragon.
I'm Critter
Lady
Shy.
Punnet. Sorry. Cat's being impatient. I'm Lady Punnet.
And I'm Critter Shy.
And we'll see you next